Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Old Code Podcast, episode 25. I am your host, the Professor. I wanted to give a quick shout out. I saw the last episode really blew up on, not really blew up on YouTube, but more than I've seen. Got like some 400 views or something like that. And for me, I've only been doing this for a little bit, and I am just doing this as a hobby. It means a lot, the appreciation, the recognition, so I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Today's episode, we are talking about Marxism, of all things. We're going to talk a little bit about its history, we're going to talk a little bit about its implications, and ultimately, why I have such a bold title for this episode. We're talking about how it is currently changing and even destroying the world that we live in today. So, sorry, I'm drinking water today. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, the term Marxism is thrown around quite a bit in today's day and age. We've got cultural Marxism always thrown around in conservative circles. We have Marxism just as an ideology being supported by liberals, and liberalism has kind of co-opted any sort of sense of what Marx is. So what is Marxism though? So Marxism is pretty well wrapped up in pretty much the first sentence after the preamble of Marx's Communist Manifesto. He states, chapter 1, that if you were to, and this is me paraphrasing for you, if you were to sum up all of history, it would be class struggle. He then goes on to list lords and serfs, kings, peasants, journeymen, apprentices. He clarifies effectively that this is oppressor versus oppressed categories. And that's all that history is made up of, is this economic disparagement between those who are in ruling classes, oppressors, and those who are in the subjugated classes, which are the oppressed. You have the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the ruling versus the people. Marxism, then, in Marx's view, seeks to do away with those economic forms of imbalance and imbalances of power through multiple categories. First of all, if you have no more kings, then you have no more countries. There's a very borderless understanding within classical Marxism. The major ideology in classical Marxism was the seizing the means of production, which is most aptly fleshed out in his understanding of Das Kapital, volumes 1 through 3. It's the idea of, in capitalism, you have individuals and groups who possess the capital and are able to, or who possess capital and are able to purchase the machinery and pay for the wages of people in order to produce goods. And part of seizing the means of production is then passing off the ability, or there's a collective element of ownership to the means of production. It is when all people are able to have an equal stake in factories and in just in any means of production, really. So his ideology was essentially shifting power and economic prosperity away from the aristocracy and away from the people who have large amounts of money, particularly in his day and age, because we started to see shifts away from particularly in America, shifts away from the aristocracy being the only ones to possess the means of production to moneyed individuals. So before, it used to be if you were a lord or a king, you had a lot of money, therefore you could have a means of production. You could purchase a factory, or you could do anything along those lines, especially post-industrial revolution and in the context of America, where there was no real aristocracy, quote unquote. What you ended up having was people who could become investors, or they could strike it big by being business owners, to such an extent that we had to put in legislation to avoid monopolies, because people were becoming so successful, and then they would just accumulate wealth and accumulate other businesses. All of that. So that's a classical idea of Marxism, and I wish you could see, but I'm talking with my hands quite a bit right now. But so that's the classical understanding of Marxism, which eventually moved into the Leninist Marxist ideology, which ultimately became Bolshevism, or I believe Leninist kind of emerged out of Bolshevism. I need to double check that. But Bolshevism emerged in Russia. There became a frustration with the aristocracy. There was an extreme economic disparagement between the lower class and the upper class. It's culminated in the brutal murder and storming of the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, the Romanovs, Nikolai and Alexandra Romanov, who during a particular winter, I believe it was 1915, 16, somewhere around there, were brutally murdered. I need to double check that. Give me 1 second, actually. So Nikolai and Alexandra were murdered in 1917. Just had to double check that in order to make sure that I had my facts right. Bolshevik Revolution started right around then, which led to the aristocracy being dethroned, essentially, and this was due to frustrations. Long story short, Russia had been at war for quite some time. Nicholas had desired to show a strong hand as Tsar, or king, as it were, of Russia, and decided to pour a lot of government funding into military action, as opposed to paying attention to the internal ordering of his people. This led to massive amounts of poverty, which then led to the Bolsheviks coming to power and overthrowing the authority in Russia. So you can start to see how this is developing not only into a theoretical ideology, but then into an actual practical ideology, where people are saying, you know what happens if we actually overthrow these oppressors and oppressed categories? Now, if you fast forward to later on, Soviet bloc, communist Russia, all of the above, we can see that communism and socialism actually did not. It becomes a farce in an economic sense. You can see this in China, where there's a supposed People's Republic, where the people are the ones to own the means of production. However, again, in every historical instance of socialism and communism, the idea that it is the people who are owning or have the public stake in it becomes a farce, as the figureheads within the government just devolve into pretty much fascistic behavior. So, moving on from the Bolsheviks, we can then move on to see actually Hitler's rise to power, and we can see, though Hitler would deride Marxist ideology, and he would deride the fact that Marx himself was a Jew. You can actually see that Nazism could not have emerged out of an atmosphere without Marxism. And what do I mean by that? So Marx pictures this world where there's no oppressor and oppressed categories. Rather, there are just people who are able to live, and they are all working communally. Hitler reframes this in a sense of a nationalist context, where he's looking and going, all right, there is an oppressive category of people. There's a oppressive category of people who seem to be ethnically charged. We can look over the course of German history and say that the Jews have taken over the banks. They have a strong say in the media. They have effectively done terrible things to our country at the expense of our own people. So Hitler puts a nationalist spin on Marxism, even though he would publicly completely rebuke the ideology. So Hitler was the first to put kind of an ethnic charge to Marxist ideology, even though he publicly said, I don't like Marxism. However, in the category of National Socialism, that's where he believes that socialism can only ever exist in a nationalist context. Thus became the idea of people for their own land, or Germany for Germans, essentially. It's a bit of a touchy subject at the moment, because I don't want to be misconstrued as an anti-Semite. I also don't want to be misconstrued as anything along those lines. So Hitler sees that there has been a particular ethnic group that has not been doing great things for his country, convinces the German people that, you know what, it's okay to be German. And you know what, it's okay to be for your own country. And in fact, you should be for your own country. So there's a nationalist and ethnic charge now to Marxism. It never really got that far with Russia, as Russia became kind of an internationalist ideology. It was very much the Soviet bloc, I should say, the Soviet Union became an internationalist ideology, absorbing other countries into itself. You can see Germany start to try to do that, but really they're not trying to absorb these other countries into themselves. They are just trying to push Germany into effectively the new Roman Empire. They're not trying to say, okay, there's no international boundaries anymore. They're saying we're conquering other lands. So that's the violent history of Marxism up until about 1945. Now, Marxism after that develops into a philosophical framework, really. It's really starting with the Frankfurt School. In Germany, I believe Germany or Austria, I don't remember right now. Anyway, predominantly German philosophers. I should clarify that much I know for certain. So with the Frankfurt School, it becomes less of a violent ideology and more of a philosophical ideology. Marxism spreads out and goes, what if it's not just economic categories? What if it's racial categories? What if it's gender categories? All of these things, because it starts to co-opt certain ideas from feminism. It starts to expand its boundaries to say, okay, the oppressed categories aren't just economically charged. They can be gendered. They can be racially biased. They can, and oftentimes the racial lens was coming into focus because a lot of these philosophers in the Frankfurt School were German Jewish or French Jewish, so they were hot on the heels of being oppressed themselves, or pursued, biased against. So this develops over the course of time. You then start to see, this is the 1940s to the 1960s, starting in the 1960s to the 1970s, you have the French Marxist school, which I believe Althusser is his name. I believe it was Althusser, who was the teacher to Michel Foucault, or Michael Foucault, however you want to pronounce it. Now, Foucault was kind of the first one to bring Marxism to its final logical conclusion. He was a postmodernist, though he rejected the title. He was an existentialist, though he rejected the title. But it doesn't matter how much you reject a title from the outside if everything you are describing and living out is categorized as, can be categorized in that camp. It doesn't matter if you reject the title, you are living out that category. So Foucault, being a postmodernist, Marxist, existentialist, is viewing things through the lens of psychoanalytics. He was very influenced by Nietzsche. He was very influenced by Freud. So in his influences through Nietzsche, he saw the idea of the Übermensch who was capable of, in a godless society, determining his own values, his own morals, his own direction. All of this is then bound up in the individual. Briefly tying in Freud has this idea, and I believe I've teased this out in the past, but Freud has this image where mental illness is caused by repression. It is caused by repressed tendencies and repressed inclinations. The individual experiences neuroses or mental illness in response to the fact that he has repressed his own aspects of his own ego, and he has forced it into the unconscious. And the conscious and unconscious are then at war with itself. Society imposes a normative principle upon the individual, and since the individual cannot fully actualize those ideas, the individual must repress, and out of that tension and pressure comes neuroses and mental illness. So Foucault taking the ideas of Nietzsche with the Übermensch, Foucault taking the ideas of Freud with mental illness simply emerging out of repressed categories, and Marxist ideology where all oppression is bad. He starts down this path of systematically questioning in a deconstructionist fashion pretty much everything about society. And so he goes through the history of mental illness and says that what we understand as madness throughout the classical and Renaissance period is a means by which the ruling normative class is oppressing the subjugated and downtrodden class. He views the lens of sexuality through the lens of there is a normative ruling class, and they have the ability to impose that view upon everybody else. Foucault himself, being a homosexual, even started advocating for pedophilia, saying that a child is perfectly capable of consent, and to say that they are not is actually to be oppressive towards the child. He and Chomsky ended up butting heads on certain ideas of justice because in his category, crime was an imposed category. All of this to say, this tees up what we then find in third wave feminism, which is the full co-opting of Marxist and critical theory. Critical theory then is the idea that, allow me to organize my thoughts. Critical theory then is the idea that there is, no matter what, going to be a ruling class, or there is a normative majority that seeks to oppress the subjugated minorities. And this can oftentimes be actualized through unconscious bias. Effectively, the category at this moment is everyone who has power is always going to try to keep those who do not have power without power. I hope you're starting to see how this is actualizing itself in modern society. So, first of all, we can see very clearly, I think that, I'll say this, I think that brings us to today, where no matter where you turn, you are constantly confronted with this idea that you are secretly a monster, that you secretly have some sort of oppressive category to you, unless you are a black, gay, transsexual at this point. This is the world we live in today. It's the idea that if you have power, then you are going to inflict that power upon somebody else. If you are a man, you are bound to be at least a little unconsciously sexist. If you are white, you are at least unconsciously bound to be racist in some manner of speaking. And this is because these are categories that ultimately belong to what has historically been a ruling class. Now you can start to see how this actually ties in with Hitler's accusation of the Jews, saying, and you can even see this with the narrative of, I'm tired of seeing rich white men in power in the government. Sounds an awful lot like Hitler's accusation of, I'm really tired of seeing all these Jews have all the money and all the power and all the say. The problem arises when there is a boundless, there's no boundary to the criticism. There's no boundary to where this ends, ultimately. And secondarily, it also doesn't take into account any manner of human condition. I can see that it's actually perfectly natural over the course of history to experience majority bias, is what I'll say. Others would probably call it tribalism. It's the idea of we trust people who look like us. It's ironic because Marxism leans on the idea that we don't need rulers and we don't need leaders. We don't need people to tell us what to do. But ultimately, it backfires on itself because it says that no matter what, there's always going to be an oppressive category. So if we don't need leaders and if we don't need rulers, then why are people trying to tell the leaders and the rulers what to do? Why do we have to be told that there's people who are doing bad things? And Foucault would say we shouldn't. We shouldn't have to, because crime is an imposed category. We can also actually see this in our media. We can see this in the treatment of powerful people in media. It's fascinating because we can see this in particularly the superhero narrative, Long story short, you can see this in any time you see, I want to say a couple of years ago, we saw this hash of these in TV shows asking the question of, what if Superman was bad? You can see this in The Boys, or in the Amazon series The Boys. I believe it was called Brightburn a couple of years ago. It's all of these different narratives that the idea is there's people with power, and those are the people who are going to abuse the power the most. Coincidentally, it's funny, actually, you saw this in the Rings of Power as well, where pretty much every ruling or leading individual, if they were a man, they were either a fool or they were evil. If they were women, they were good. You see this in Glorfindel. He was kind of nearsighted. He didn't see the problem that Sauron could come back. You see this in, I believe there's a kind of sly, trickery sort of fellow in oh goodness, what was it? Numenor. But the one character that is actually the one male character that's portrayed in a good light is Isildur's father. I don't remember his name right now. Isildur's father is the right hand to the Queen Regent, and he is very much portrayed in this good light. He's the only male character that I can actually go, you know what, actually, he's being portrayed in a positive light, but you can see him as he's being portrayed in a positive light as he's subject to a woman. Nothing bad with women. Saying this because the narrative that they're spinning is that the best man is the one who is under a woman. That being all of that summed up, we see this in the media, we see this in politics, we even see this in day-to-day life, we see this in the church. How many times do we see people in the church talking about how we want to get away from the high ivory tower ideas of theology and philosophy? We want to get down to the concrete, the nitty-gritty. We want to get to the down and dirty, as it were. All of this is Marxist in inclination, and it's Marxist because it's libertarian. Going to make a lot of people upset because but libertarianism is at its heart, it comes from a form of Marxist ideology. Now, libertarianism leans more anarcho-capitalist, but libertarianism, like Marxism, says, I don't want anybody else to tell me what to do. So the very libertarian, Marxist, individualist mindset is one of the things that is currently actively destroying our society. And that's where I think I'm going to conclude with this final statement, with the final section, if I may. The idea within contemporary Marxism, contemporary individualism, is no one can tell me what to do, no one can tell me who to be. Any sort of external categorization is in fact a form of oppression. You see this in transgender ideology, you see this in feminist ideology, you see this in racist ideology. It's the idea that so long as I appeal to a form of oppressed category, I am capable of being fully self-actualized. The problem is that in Marxist self-actualization, you actually rule out a great many really beneficial personal character attributes. You rule out the ability to be driven to success, to be ambitious, really, because success oftentimes requires you to have people's help along the way. One could even argue that in you listening to this podcast right now, this is me oppressing my ideology upon you. That is putting me in a oppressor category and you in the oppressed category. In order to make money selling a certain product, you need people to give you their money, and that is them giving what they have earned, their time, to you for material gain. Everything in our lives then is, as far as success goes, is recast in this image of, oh, I really don't want to, and there's nothing wrong with not wanting to put anybody else under your foot. But when you become economically successful, you are then placed in a category. If you want to be truthful, the idea of truth itself is an imposition, it's an oppressive category. If you want to be lovingly assertive in truth, this implies that you are in the right, which means that you have a moral value, which means that somebody else is in the moral wrong, which means you are saying somebody else is inferior. A great many virtues, temperance, even the idea of physical fitness. You see this in, if you say, I want to become, I want to lose weight. I don't want to be fat. That's fat phobic. There's all of the above. It really completely limits the individual to a certain number of Marxist categories, to the extent where as a man, I can't actually blame women for wanting to become transgender, because you're being told your entire life that you, no matter what, if you're a woman, you're going to be oppressed by men. And the only way to get out of that is by becoming a man. If you can't beat them, join them, I suppose. This is the ideology that is destroying our country. It is the ideology that is destroying our world. And it is not tied to a particular group of people. It's not tied to women. It's not tied to a race. And to some degree or another, the alpha male content has bought into the Marxist and even, dare I say, Nazi-ish lie. Because so many voices in this sphere are currently saying, women are the problem. Women are destroying men. Women are doing this. Women are doing that. That's the same lie that Hitler used with the Jews. That's the same lie that the Bolsheviks used with the aristocracy. It's the same lie that Foucault used with any sort of category for justice. These are lies. The enemy is not people. The enemy is the ideology. And we must fight against this ideology, because as much as it is not an oppressive category for a parent and a child, I should just say, I am saying it is not an oppressive category between parent and child. It is not an oppressive category between pastor and congregant. It is not an oppressive category between police and citizens. It's not an oppressive category between ruler and ruled. It can become an avenue for oppression, and that was Marx's big, actual good observation, is he should have just stopped recognizing that these can be avenues for oppression, but he viewed it as these were always going to be not just avenues, but these institutes are in themselves oppressive states. And that's where we're currently at today in viewing critical race theory and everything, where every time a Black person goes to jail, they are a victim of a system, not a victim of a person or an individual bias. They are victims of a system. Every time we talk about the wage gap, they are victims of the system and all of that, which actually creates a more nebulous enemy. And so if they are the ones fighting on an ideological level, we can't be the ones to fight on a people level. We need to fight back against them, against the idea itself, because they are looking at it through the lens of there's an ideological problem and we need to fight against the people. What we need to do is fight against the ideology, and we can't just provide confirmation bias. We need to live out examples that exemplify why their ideology is wrong. And one of the best ways we can do that is by being good, either coworkers or bosses, or if you're in state of public service, being a good senator or a good police officer. It's by being a good parent, by being a good husband, by being a good ruler, a good leader. And that is how we are going to fight against an ideology. We fight against ideology through our actions, by proving our own ideology as more viable. And I think that's all I got for you today. This was kind of an info dump. I hope this made sense for you, and I hope that this gave you a good lens to view things through. I don't want you to run around flaunting this information. I don't want you to be a jerk about it. I want you to take this information and I want you to be gentle and gracious, because that's really the big thing, is that the gospel flips all of it on its head. There's nowhere in scripture that says give up power. It says to whom much is given, much will be expected. There's nowhere in scripture that says if you're a king, stop being a king. It says that there is a king above kings, and that gives us an understanding that there is one who is going to hold all kings accountable. It doesn't say servants overthrow your masters. It says be good servants. It also says be good masters. It says be loving. And that is how we are going to fight back against the ideology and the ideological system that is currently taking the world by storm. So this has been the 25th episode of the Old Code Podcast. I really appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this episode finds you well. That's all for now. If you like the episode, please like and share, subscribe, and all of that. I try to do this twice a week, so I'll catch you later.